They didn't find her in a bedroom. They didn't find her in the house. They found her in the front trunk of his Tesla. 14 years old. Dismembered. And the man prosecutors say was responsible was already performing for millions. This is not just a murder case. It is the story of how someone could build an image so clean, while hiding something far darker underneath. Because before the headlines, before the courtroom, before the autopsy report that made even veteran investigators stop and stare, there was a girl named Celeste Rivas. And there was a man the internet knew by another name. D4VD. A rising musician. Young. Famous. The kind of name that moves fast online. Streams. Concert clips. Fans defending him before they even know the facts. The kind of public image that makes people hesitate before believing the worst. But prosecutors are not describing a misunderstanding. They are describing something brutal, something deliberate, something that ended with a child's body hidden in a vehicle. And every new detail makes the story darker. Because according to investigators, this did not begin when police found her. It began much earlier, long before the missing person posters, long before the search warrants, long before anyone outside that circle understood who Celeste was. People close to this case say the relationship may have started when she was far younger than anyone should be comfortable hearing. 12, possibly younger. Some online conversations suggest 11. That detail matters because it changes everything. This stops being a bad relationship. It becomes grooming, control, a pattern, a child pulled into the orbit of an adult who already understood exactly what he was doing. And the internet may have seen pieces of it long before police did. Discord, Reddit, private chats, fan circles, screenshots that at the time looked like rumors. A girl with a name starting with C. A middle school student. Someone people casually mentioned like it was strange, but not enough to stop it. And that is one of the hardest parts of this case. How often warning signs exist, but only make sense after something terrible happens. Because hindsight is brutal. It turns ignored details into evidence. And suddenly, things people laughed off become impossible to forget. A post, a message, a reference to Hello Kitty sandals, a girl who was obviously too young, a pattern hiding in plain sight. Celeste was not supposed to become a headline. She was supposed to be a teenager. School, friends, the ordinary life 14-year-olds are supposed to get. Instead, she became part of an investigation so disturbing that even seasoned forensic experts called the autopsy report difficult to read. And when those people say difficult, they mean something. Because autopsy reports are written to remove emotion. Clinical words, measured language, cold facts. That distance usually protects the reader. This one didn't. Because when the report finally surfaced, it answered the question everyone had been asking. How did she die? And the answer was worse than people expected. Multiple sharp force injuries, deep enough to strike bone. One wound reaching the liver. A slow death. Not instant. Not accidental. Not a moment of chaos. A death with time inside it. Pain inside it. Awareness. And for many people following the case, that was the moment everything changed. Because until then, some still wanted to believe there was another explanation. There was. The report described defensive wounds, meaning she fought. She tried. Cuts to the fingers. Damage that suggests instinct. The human body trying to stay alive. And then details that made the case even harder to process. Partially skeletonized remains. One eye missing. Drug traces in her system. Methamphetamine. MDMA. Questions that opened even more questions. What happened before she died? How long was she suffering? Who knew? What was planned? And what was covered up after? Because this case is not only about murder. It is about concealment. What happened after? What someone does when the violence is over. And according to investigators, that part may be just as disturbing. Because police say her remains were hidden inside the front trunk of a Tesla. Not abandoned in the woods. Not left somewhere distant. Hidden inside a car. Contained. Close. A place that suggests not panic, but handling. Decision-making. Time. And if that detail sounds impossible, that is exactly why it matters. Because it forces a question no one wants to ask. How long can someone live beside horror and still act normal? That question sits at the center of this case. Because while Celeste was gone, life outside kept moving. Music kept playing. Posts stayed up. The public image continued. And that contrast is what makes these stories feel unreal. Performance on one side. Silence on the other. Success on one side. A child disappearing on the other. It is the split between who someone appears to be and what investigators say they were doing when no one was looking. That split is where this story lives. And it is where the prosecution is building its case. Not from one dramatic moment. From accumulation. Search warrants. Cloud data. Phone evidence. Witness statements. Wiretaps. Images investigators say should never have existed on that phone in the first place. And once those pieces started coming together, this stopped being internet rumor. It became a murder prosecution. The courtroom would come later. But first, there was the discovery. And once police found Celeste, there was no going back. If you're interested in real cases like this, the ones that go deeper than what people usually see, consider subscribing to Obscura Case Report. There's a lot more like this coming. Before the charges, before the headlines called her a victim, there was Celeste, 14 years old, still young enough that details from her life hit differently. Hello Kitty sandals, school routines, the kind of small things that remind people this was not a woman living an adult life. This was a child. And that matters. Because in true crime coverage, people sometimes lose the victim inside the story. They become evidence. A name inside a report. A photograph shown for 5 seconds before the focus shifts back to the suspect. That is how stories become distorted. And it is important not to let that happen here. Because Celeste was not a symbol. She was a girl with a family. People who expected her home. People who knew how she laughed. People who noticed when she stopped answering. And families notice silence faster than police ever do. That is usually where these stories begin. Not with law enforcement. With instinct. Something feels wrong. A missed call. A routine broken. a silence that does not fit the person you know. And for the people closest to Celeste, that silence kept getting louder. At first, maybe it looked like distance. Teenagers disappear into their own worlds sometimes. They stop replying. They disappear into phones, into arguments, into private things adults do not fully understand. That explanation works until it doesn't, because eventually patterns tell the truth. And Celeste's pattern said something was wrong. Very wrong. She was not simply pulling away. She was gone. And somewhere inside that disappearance was David Burke, the man many people knew as D4VD. The name mattered because fame changes how cases move. Not legally, socially. It creates defenders before facts, doubt before evidence, people asking what she did, before asking what happened to her. That is one of the ugliest parts of cases like this. The victim gets questioned first. The suspect gets protected first. And when the suspect is famous, that effect multiplies. But investigators were not working off fan loyalty. They were working off evidence. And slowly, the story started shifting from concern to something far worse. At first, it did not look like a homicide. It looked like confusion, a missing teenager, a family trying to understand why someone they knew so well had suddenly gone silent. That is how many of these cases begin. Not with sirens, with denial. People searching for ordinary explanations because the truth feels too large to accept. Maybe she left her phone somewhere. Maybe she was staying with friends. Maybe there had been an argument. Maybe she just needed space. Families tell themselves these things because the alternative is unbearable. Because once you allow yourself to think something terrible happened, you cannot put that thought back. But the problem with lies is that real life leaves traces. And Celeste's life was leaving none. No normal messages. No believable explanation. No clear reason for disappearance. And the longer that silence lasted, the more attention shifted toward the people closest to her. That is where investigators always go first. Not because proximity proves guilt, because proximity creates opportunity. Who last saw her? Who knew where she was? Who had access? Who had reason to explain her absence before anyone asked? And that is where David Burke kept appearing. Not as a distant rumor, as a constant presence. Someone already connected to her life. Someone people online had been talking about long before police were publicly involved. At first, those online conversations looked like gossip. The internet is full of false accusations. People say things behind anonymous usernames they would never defend in daylight. Most of it means nothing. But sometimes, the internet notices danger before institutions do. Sometimes the people in chat rooms are watching something adults around them are missing. That possibility became impossible to ignore. Screenshots began resurfacing. Old Discord messages, Reddit threads, references from people who said they knew there was a girl. Young, very young. A girl named Celeste. A middle school student. The kind of detail that sounds unbelievable, until it repeats often enough to stop sounding like coincidence. And then there were the posts people could not stop revisiting. The references to Hello Kitty. At first it sounds small, almost stupid, until you realize what it represents. Childhood, a detail so young it strips away any illusion that this was an equal relationship. One report described her missing in Hello Kitty sandals. That detail stayed with people because it made the age impossible to ignore. Not theory, not speculation, a visual reminder of exactly how young she was. And once people began connecting those details, the public conversation changed. This was no longer gossip about a musician dating someone too young. This was the possibility of a child being controlled by an adult with power, access, and influence. That changes how investigators look at everything. Because grooming does not begin with violence. It begins with access, attention, isolation, dependency. A person making themselves feel necessary to someone too young to understand what is happening. That is why prosecutors care so much about timelines. Not just the murder. The beginning. When did contact start? Who knew? How old was she? What was happening before anyone thought to call police? Because murder cases are often solved by the months before the murder, not only the day it happened. And prosecutors appear to believe that timeline goes back much further than people first assumed. Potentially years. That matters. Because if true, this was not a sudden act. It was a long road. And long roads leave evidence. Digital footprints, photos, cloud backups, messages people thought were deleted, things said casually online that become devastating in court. That is where search warrants begin. Phones, iCloud, social media, every private space people trust more than they should. Because people forget one thing. Technology remembers even when they try not to. Investigators reportedly executed broad warrants tied to Burke's phone and cloud storage. And what prosecutors later said in court changed the temperature of the entire case. They referenced illegal images involving children. A large amount. Not rumor. Not internet speculation. A prosecutor saying it in open court. That moment matters because it changes the defense landscape completely. Now the argument is no longer only about whether he killed Celeste. It becomes a larger picture of behavior. Pattern. Intent. A prosecutor does not mention evidence like that casually. They mention it because they want the court to understand who they believe they are dealing with. And once that entered the case, the public reaction intensified. Because people can process scandal. They struggle to process predation, especially involving children, especially when fame helped protect the image. Burke's defense team pushed back strongly. They insisted he was innocent. They demanded the case move fast. A preliminary hearing. Evidence on the table. No quiet waiting. That tells you something too. Defense strategy often begins with speed. Either because they believe weak evidence will collapse under scrutiny, or because they know delay lets public perception harden. And public perception in this case was becoming brutal. Because the more details emerged, the harder it became to explain them away. A child, a body, a Tesla, search warrants, wiretaps, illegal images, and an autopsy report so disturbing people who read autopsies for a living called it unforgettable. That is not a normal criminal case. That is the kind of case that follows someone forever. Even before trial. Even before conviction. Because some accusations become larger than the courtroom. They become identity. And for D4VD, that split between public image and criminal allegation was now impossible to ignore. He walked into court in County Orange, shackled, 21 years old, calm according to reporters, at times looking bored, speaking briefly. Yes, ma'am. Simple answers. Controlled. That image matters because people expect monsters to look like monsters. They rarely do. They look calm, young, ordinary, sometimes almost detached. That contrast unsettles people more than rage ever could. Because rage is easy to understand. Calm after horror is harder. Reporters watching him noted that. Not panic, not collapse, composure. And for victims' families, that kind of composure can feel like another injury. Because grief is chaos. And when the person accused of causing that grief looks untouched by it, people remember. But courtrooms are built on evidence, not emotion. And prosecutors were still building. There were mentions of a wiretap. No full public explanation. Just enough to signal that investigators believed the case required surveillance beyond ordinary procedure. Wiretaps are not casual tools. They require justification. Judges. Time. That means investigators believed there was enough concern to listen closely. Very closely. And when law enforcement reaches that point, they usually already know the case is bigger than what the public sees. Because the public only hears the loud details. The body, the arrest, the headline. But cases are actually built in quieter places. Metadata, timestamps, location history, receipts, deleted files. The boring things that become devastating when lined up correctly. That is where prosecutors win. Not with dramatic speeches. With consistency. With evidence that keeps agreeing with itself. And somewhere inside that evidence, they believe the story of Celeste's final days became clear. Clear enough for murder charges. Clear enough to stand in court and say homicide. Clear enough for one of the most disturbing discoveries in the case. They did not just believe she died. They believed someone worked very hard to make sure she would not be found. And that brings us to the car. Because once investigators opened that Tesla, this case stopped being theory. It became something physical. Something impossible to explain away. And what they found inside would define everything that came after. The Tesla changed everything. Before that, there was still room for argument. Rumors, online speculation, people defending him because they liked the music more than they cared about the facts. But once investigators opened that front trunk, the case stopped being abstract. It became physical, real, a place, a smell, evidence that could not be explained away with fan loyalty or internet arguments. Because prosecutors say that is where they found Celeste. Inside the front trunk. The frunk, not in some distant location, not hidden miles away. Inside a vehicle connected directly to the man now standing in court. That detail alone made national headlines. Because it sounds like something written for television. A child's remains hidden inside a luxury electric car. But crime rarely cares how unbelievable it sounds. It only cares what happened. And what investigators found inside that vehicle forced the case into a different category. This was no longer a missing person case. This was homicide, and not just homicide. Concealment, dismemberment, planning, because bodies do not end up hidden that way by accident. Someone made choices, repeated choices, and every one of those choices matters in court. According to reporting around the autopsy and investigative findings, Celeste's body was not intact. Her head was separated. Her remains were contained. One bag for the head, another for the rest of her body. And one detail disturbed even experienced investigators: the use of an actual body bag. Not trash bags alone. A real body bag. The kind used by coroners. The kind designed for the dead. That detail matters because it says something beyond disposal. It suggests preparation, premeditation. You do not casually have a body bag. You acquire one. You think ahead. And forensic experts immediately focused on that. Not just because of symbolism, because of science. Body bags hold evidence. Handles, zippers, fibers, touch DNA, sweat trapped inside rough nylon straps. Every point of contact becomes a possible witness. Forensic investigators reportedly treated it exactly that way. Swabbing handles, examining zippers, looking for transfer. Because if someone moved that bag without gloves, they may have left themselves all over it. That is how real cases work. Not dramatic confessions. Tiny traces. A fingerprint where someone forgot. DNA where someone assumed there would be none. The arrogance of believing cleanup means disappearance. It doesn't. It means work for the lab. And the lab never gets tired. But even before those results, the autopsy report itself was enough to shake people. Because once the medical examiner put words to what happened, there was no way to soften it. Cause of death, homicide. Mechanism, multiple sharp force injuries. But those clean words hide brutality. One wound entered the left side of her chest. Another reached the right upper abdomen, deep enough to strike the liver. That matters because the liver is not forgiving. It is one of the most vascular organs in the human body. Meaning when it is cut, blood loss is massive, vast, internal, and according to forensic analysis, that injury suggests something terrifying. This was not instant. She did not simply collapse. She likely remained conscious, aware, bleeding internally, feeling her life leaving slowly. That is the part experts could not stop talking about. Because violent death is one thing. Slow violent death is another. It changes how you understand the final minutes. It turns the case from murder into suffering. And that matters. Not only emotionally. Legally. Juries react differently when they understand time. Pain. Awareness. It becomes personal. And prosecutors know that. Then there were the defensive wounds. Small details. Cuts to fingers. Damage to the hand. The kind of injuries that tell a simple human story. She fought. She raised her hands. She tried to stop what was happening. People hear defensive wounds and think legal language. It is not. It is survival written on the body. A person saying no with every instinct they have left. That reality hits hard in cases involving children. Because people imagine the terror, the imbalance, The fact that she was 14 and the person hurting her was not. And then came the details that made even veteran crime reporters pause. Her left eye was gone. Part of the skull partially skeletonized. 2 fingers missing. Methamphetamine in her system. MDMA in her system. The questions multiplied immediately. Was she drugged? Was the violence escalating before death? Were these injuries part of the attack? Or what happened after? Forensic experts debated specifics. Decomposition can explain some things. Insect activity, time, environmental damage, but not everything. And when details remain unclear, juries fill silence with imagination, often worse than reality. That is why prosecutors and defense both fight so hard over autopsy language. Words matter. One phrase can decide whether a jury sees panic or torture. Joe Scott Morgan, a veteran death investigator, made a point that stayed with many people following the case. People do not casually keep body bags at home. That sounds obvious, but obvious things matter because it points toward mindset, preparation, an interest in death that goes beyond panic after the fact. A person does not reach for a body bag by instinct. They think about death first. That is where psychology enters the case. Not just what happened. What kind of person prepares for what happens after? And that question becomes even darker when prosecutors begin describing what else they allegedly found. Because murder evidence tells you what happened once. Other evidence can tell you whether violence was part of a larger pattern. That is what the prosecution appears to be building. Not an isolated tragedy. A portrait. One where Celeste was not random. She was part of a system of behavior already forming long before police got involved. That is why the child sexual abuse material allegations matter so much. Because they create motive context. Not legal guilt by themselves. Context. They tell a jury prosecutors are not describing one terrible night. They are describing someone whose private life already contained predatory behavior. And when that merges with homicide, the case becomes heavier, harder to defend, harder for the public to separate art from accusation. That is where celebrity collapses. Because talent can protect image. It cannot protect evidence. And once autopsy photos, forensic findings, and warrant details enter court, streams and fan edits stop mattering. Only facts survive. But facts do not arrive alone. They arrive with questions. Where was she killed? Was it in the house? In the car? Somewhere else entirely? Where is the blood? How much was cleaned? Who helped? Did anyone know? Because dismemberment is not simple. It takes time, tools, nerve. That raises another uncomfortable truth. Cases like this often involve more silence than one person. People see things, hear things, ignore things, especially around fame, especially when speaking up means stepping into public fire. And prosecutors may still be building that side of the case. Because once the body is found, the next battle begins, proving exactly how it happened, exactly who knew, and exactly how much of the horror was hidden in plain sight. By the time the courtroom filled for the first major hearings, the public already believed they knew the story. But trials are where stories get tested. And the prosecution was preparing to show that what looked horrifying from the outside might be even worse underneath. By the time David Burke walked into court in chains, the internet had already decided who he was. That happens now, long before a jury ever hears evidence, long before a witness takes the stand. People choose sides. Fans defend. Critics attack. Strangers turn tragedy into content. And somewhere inside all of that noise, a 14-year-old girl can disappear behind the argument. That is why court matters. Because a courtroom does not care about followers. It cares about proof. And prosecutors were making it clear they believed they had it. Not one dramatic piece. A structure. Search warrants. Phone records. Cloud backups. Witnesses. Wiretaps. Autopsy findings. The kind of case built slowly, piece by piece, until denial becomes harder than acceptance. When Burke appeared in court, reporters described him as calm. Almost bored. Orange jail-issued jumpsuit. Shackles. Minimal words. Yes, ma'am. No visible panic. No emotional collapse. That image stayed with people. Because the public expects visible guilt. Sweat. Fear. Something dramatic. But people accused of terrible things often look ordinary. Sometimes that is what unsettles people most. The absence of visible emotion. Especially when the accusations involve a child. Especially when the victim's family is sitting in the same room, carrying a grief no camera can fully capture. There was supposed to be a major preliminary hearing. The kind of hearing where witnesses begin laying out the state's theory. Where the public gets its first real glimpse of how prosecutors plan to prove murder. Instead, much of it became procedural. Scheduling. Discovery battles. Status hearings. Frustrating for viewers. Normal for homicide cases. Because before trial, both sides fight over information. And in this case, there was a lot of it. Terabytes. That word matters. Terabytes. Not a folder. Not a few screenshots. Massive digital evidence. Enough that defense attorneys immediately argued they needed more time. Because modern murder cases are often won inside devices. Text. Deleted files. Location history. Private messages. Photos people forgot existed. Cloud storage that remembers what memory tries to erase. Every device becomes a witness. Sometimes a better one than people. That is likely where prosecutors believe the strongest parts of this case live. Because bodies tell you death happened. Phones tell you how life looked before it did. Who was talking? Who stopped? Who lied? Who moved? Who searched for something they should never have searched for? That is where juries start leaning forward. Because digital evidence feels objective. Cold. Less emotional. Harder to dismiss. And prosecutors added another explosive claim. They said investigators uncovered a large amount of child sexual abuse material connected to the case. That statement hit like another indictment. Even before trial. Because it changes how the public hears everything else. The defense insisted innocence. Of course they did. They pushed for hearings. For scrutiny. For speed. Because in a case like this, delay can become its own punishment. Every headline becomes part of the sentence before a verdict exists. And yet prosecutors did not sound like people guessing. They sounded like people arranging a timeline. That distinction matters. Because homicide prosecutions are rarely about surprise. They are about sequence. When did contact begin? When did control begin? When did violence begin? And when did concealment begin? That last part may be the most important, because once someone dies, behavior afterward can destroy a defense. Cleaning, moving, lying, buying time. Those actions speak loudly, sometimes louder than the killing itself. And in this case, prosecutors appear to believe there was a deliberate effort to hide what happened. Not only physically, socially, digitally, emotionally. A performance of normal life while horror sat just outside the frame. That performance is something psychologists pay attention to, because some offenders are driven by panic, others by control. Control looks different. It is organized, calm, focused on image. It values appearances more than remorse. One psychologist following the case described a mindset like this simply. The victim stops being a person and becomes a problem to solve. That line matters, because it explains why concealment can look colder than violence. Violence can be rage. Concealment is decision. Repeated decisions. And repeated decisions are hard for juries to forgive, especially when the victim is 14. Especially when the accused is an adult with status, access, and power. That imbalance changes how every fact feels. It turns ordinary evidence into moral evidence. A jury does not only hear what happened, they feel who had the power. And prosecutors understand that. They also understand symbolism. The Tesla, the body bag, the Hello Kitty details. These are not just facts. They are anchors. Things jurors remember when technical testimony gets dense. People may forget forensic terminology. They do not forget a child in Hello Kitty sandals. They do not forget a body hidden in a front trunk. They do not forget a missing eye. Cases often turn on those images, not because they replace evidence, because they make evidence unforgettable. And then there is the music, the public version of David Burke, the stage lights, the clips, the branding, lyrics people now replay looking for warning signs. One lyric drew particular attention. I killed you and I didn't even regret it. Lyrics are not confessions. They are not evidence by themselves. But context changes how people hear art. Once criminal allegations enter the picture, old words stop sounding abstract. They start sounding like clues. That creates another courtroom battle. What belongs to performance? What belongs to reality? What is persona? What is pattern? The defense will fight that hard. Because once jurors start emotionally connecting art to allegation, distance disappears. And distance is often the only thing a defense has left. Meanwhile, inside jail, Burke's complaints became their own story. Limited recreation time. Restricted movement. Isolation. Some reports described frustration about conditions. For the public, that did not generate sympathy. It generated anger. Because while he complained about fresh air, people were reading about a 14-year-old girl bleeding to death. Perspective collapses quickly in cases like that, especially when the victim can no longer speak for herself. That is where public outrage becomes permanent. Not because of one fact, because of contrast. A child dies violently. The accused complains about recreation time. That image stays. And once it stays, it shapes everything. even before trial. But the prosecution still had a larger challenge. Not proving horror, proving precision. Exactly when did Celeste die? Exactly where? Exactly what happened in those final hours? Because even when guilt feels obvious, murder cases are won on specifics. And one of the biggest battles was still ahead. The timeline. Because if prosecutors could prove the final sequence clearly, the rest of the defense might collapse with it. And buried inside that timeline was one question that could change the entire trial. Who knew before police did? In cases like this, the final truth is rarely hidden in one dramatic moment. It is hidden in timing. Who knew first? Who lied first? Who started acting like the victim was already gone, before anyone else even realized she was missing? That is where prosecutors often find the strongest case. Not only in the body, in behavior. And in the D4VD case, that timeline may be everything. Because a body in a vehicle raises one immediate question. How long was she there? Hours? Days? Longer? That answer matters. Not just for science, for intent, for opportunity, for proving whether this was panic after violence, or a system of concealment already in motion. Investigators likely turned first to the simplest witnesses. Phones. Because phones do not care about fear. They log movement, silence, location, the last text, the final call, the moment someone stops existing in the digital world. And for teenagers, that silence can be especially sharp. Social media, messages, daily contact. People that age leave constant digital footprints. When that suddenly stops, it creates a clock. And prosecutors may already know exactly where that clock begins. That is why defense attorneys were so focused on discovery. Because somewhere inside terabytes of digital evidence is likely the prosecution's spine. The sequence. And sequence is deadly in court. Because once jurors can see the order, this happened, then this, then this, reasonable doubt gets smaller, especially if the accused's own devices are telling the story. Location data, cloud photos, deleted conversations, search history, who someone called, who they stopped calling, who they lied to. Technology makes murder strangely honest. People lie. Metadata rarely does. And then there is witness testimony. Someone always knows more than they first say. Sometimes it is fear. Sometimes loyalty. Sometimes they convince themselves silence is safer. Until police start asking the right questions. Then silence becomes risk. One witness reportedly acknowledged lying to investigators for years in another major case tied to hidden violence. That detail matters here too, because it reminds us how often the truth arrives late. Not because people do not know, because they do not want to be the one who says it first. Cases built around fame are worse. People protect status. They protect access. They protect themselves. And sometimes a victim pays for that protection. That possibility hangs heavily over this story. Because if contact between Burke and Celeste began when she was 12, someone saw something. Someone knew enough to feel uncomfortable. The internet certainly did. Discord threads did not invent themselves. Screenshots do not appear from nowhere. People were watching. People were talking. The question is whether anyone acted before it was too late. That is one of the cruelest truths in true crime. Warning signs are often public. Action is private, and private action is rare, especially when the person at the center has influence. Success creates a shield. People hesitate. They tell themselves they must be misunderstanding, because accusing someone popular feels dangerous, because being wrong feels worse than staying silent, until staying silent becomes the thing that never leaves you. For Celeste's family, that silence became something permanent, because by the time police were fully involved, they were no longer looking for a missing girl. They were reconstructing the last hours of her life, trying to answer the questions families hate most. Was she afraid? Did she know what was happening? Did she suffer alone? Those are not legal questions, but they live inside every homicide case, and juries feel them even when no one says them aloud. That is why the autopsy mattered so much, not only because it proved homicide, because it gave shape to suffering. The liver wound, the defensive injuries, the evidence of struggle. That report told prosecutors they were not describing sudden violence. They were describing a fight to survive. And once a jury understands that, the emotional center of the case changes. It is no longer about whether a death occurred. It becomes about whether someone chose to let that suffering happen, or caused it. And if prosecutors can connect that suffering directly to Burke, the trial becomes brutally difficult for the defense. Because juries are human before they are legal. They imagine children. They imagine daughters. They imagine the final minutes. That imagination is powerful, sometimes more powerful than the defense can overcome. Still, the defense has a path. They will challenge certainty, not necessarily emotion. Evidence. Can prosecutors prove who inflicted the wounds? Can they prove where it happened? Can they prove no one else was involved? Can they prove the timeline without gaps? Because homicide trials do not require innocence to be believable. They require doubt, even small doubt. That is where defense lawyers live. Not in proving a better story, in breaking certainty inside the state's story. That is why every forensic detail becomes war. The eye, the fingers, the plastic fragments, the missing pieces. Some of those details are emotionally explosive. But in court, emotion is not enough. Every claim must survive cross-examination. Could decomposition explain it? Could insects? Could contamination? Could investigators be wrong? The defense does not need beauty, only fracture, only enough uncertainty for one juror to stop. That is the battlefield. But prosecutors seem prepared for that, because they are not relying on one horrific image. They are building accumulation. The body, the car, the digital trail, the illegal images, the relationship timeline, the autopsy, the witness pattern, the behavior after. Individually, defense can challenge each one. Together, they start looking like inevitability. That is how murder cases close. Not with one perfect piece, with 10 ugly ones that all point in the same direction. And then there is something even harder to defend. Normal life continuing after death. Concerts, public appearances, routine. That contrast destroys juries. Because people understand panic. They struggle to understand performance. How does someone stand under stage lights, while a child's body is hidden in a car tied to them. That question is not legal. It is moral, and moral questions often decide verdicts before instructions ever do. Which brings us to the ending every case reaches. Not arrest, not headlines, judgment. What happens if prosecutors prove all of it? What happens if they cannot? And what justice even means when the victim was 14 and the story is already bigger than the courtroom. Because conviction does not restore childhood. It does not return birthdays. It does not give a family the years stolen from them. It only names responsibility. Sometimes that is all the system can do. And sometimes even that takes years. But before trial ends, before verdicts and sentencing and appeals, there is one final part of this story people cannot ignore. Why this case hit so hard. Why it moved beyond celebrity scandal and became something much darker. Because this was never really about fame. It was about recognition. How many people saw pieces of the truth and did not realize what they were seeing? And that question stays long after headlines disappear. Because it forces something uncomfortable. Not what kind of monster did this, but how ordinary did he look while doing it?